Okay, we are streaming, I guess. Okay, so hello and welcome to everyone. And this is Mindful Conversations, a series of webinar organized by the Canadian Centre for Mindful Habitats and Algonquin College. Today we have two distinguished speakers, Dr. Vibhuti Sachdev and Roger Connah, who are joining us in this webinar titled Celebrating Disruption. And here on the screen, you can see the organizing team. We have Laura Ethier, Monica Nguyen, Christine Perron, Ashlyn Gibbs, Leanne Melnick, and myself, Pallavi Swaranjali. So today, if some of you have been watching our webinars, we've followed a certain format where that's what we will be doing today. We will have our two speakers present first back-to-back around 30 minutes each, and then we will go into our conversation section, followed by our question and answer session afterwards. And if any of you in the audience want to ask a question, please put it in the chat window. If you're watching us on YouTube, there is a chat function there as well, where we will be monitoring the questions and bringing it in here in the webinar. So today, let's welcome our first speaker, Dr. Vibhuti Sachdev. And if I may ask Christine to please introduce her briefly. Thank you.
Dr. Vibhuti Sachdev is Dean at Sushant School of Art and Architecture and Director of Architecture, Planning and Design Schools at Sushant University. She qualified as an architect in 1989 from School of Planning and Architecture in New Delhi, completed her PhD in 1996 from University of London, and has worked as a conservation consultant, writer, and designer. She has taught at the University of Sussex and written 4 books and several articles about Jaipur, traditional knowledge systems, Indian cities, and Indian modernity. Since publishing these books, Dr. Sachdev has been a consultant on the restoration of the Jal Mahal in Jaipur, was a design curator for the artwork of its pavilions, and the co-curator of the exhibition Painted Pleasures. At Sushant University, she has introduced new programs, various reforms, and innovations in teaching and learning systems in the fields of architecture, planning, and design at the undergraduate, postgraduate, and doctoral levels. She has taken the time to join us in today's webinar. So without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Vibhuti Sachdev.
Vibhuti, you're muted.
Thank you. Thank you, Christine and Pallavi. And I'm going to start straight away and go to my screen, which is screen. Okay. So I've titled this mind of the conversation as Mindful Disruptors, Continuity and Tradition at the Jaipur Court. I'll just move this away. Disruption is disturbance of problems that interrupt an event, activity, or process. In the business term, disruption really took off with Clayton Christensen's book, 1997, called The Innovator's Dilemma. So it's very much kind of nested in business studies in economics as a term which kind of triggers innovation. I would like to propose that, tradition is not a fixed monolithic practice, and continuity of especially the living traditions rests on constant disruption of its practices. Only then it is able to be a continuous tradition. This disruption, what it does, what we know disruption as a dysfunctional process, we need to delink the idea of disruption from failure and dysfunction, and also to see it as something, to reframe it as a constructive strategy that provides respite, provides a break, it provides an opportunity to reboot. And so in a way, I'm proposing that disruptions were designed strategically as mindful action. Of course, I'm taking a historical case study, and I will demonstrate that the fields of disruption is the territory between rules and taboos. It's between sanctity and sacrilege. The signs of disruption, when disruption happens, there is a suspension of routine, which is a suspension of time. And there is a suspension of context, which is a suspension of space. What disruption uses is it very often amplifies what is reduced before. In a way, it nudges the dominant out of its position by amplifying what is not obviously the dominant. What it also does sometimes is disruption uses exaggeration of the understated. It is again, of course, a way of amplification. And a disruption also sort of in that exaggeration retells the story. So the dominant characters are kind of sidelined, and new characters emerge as the dominant ones by sort of zooming into what is perhaps understated. The approach of disruption is to always test, contest, and blur boundaries. The tools that disruption often uses, it works very, very effectively when there is a shared knowledge system. Disruption also sometimes uses cultural tactics so that it is read. There are strong tacit messages. Disruption often uses diplomacy. Empathy and emotion are strong sentiments. And for disruption to be effective and constructive, it will anticipate, and indeed it welcomes resistance and addresses the counterforce. So for it to work strategically, it has to kind of almost design the response to the counterforce. And it always, invariably, for it to be effective, it will use peaceful, non-violent, and democratic methods. That is, a very essential tool of an effective disruption. The noticeable results of effective disruption are it recalibrates power positions, systems that have continued are realigned, processes are realigned, and there is a renewal of practice. And in that sense, there is a continuity of tradition when there is a constant renewal of practice. So I come to some of the examples to illustrate the concept that I've just laid out. And this is a picture of Savai Jai Singh II, who was the founder of Jaipur. He reigned between 1699 to 1743. So I'm going to use, just also to say in kind of illustrating what I've just laid out, I'm going to use three rulers of Jaipur from the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, and to show how they not only continued the vision of its founder, but also, in a way, had to disrupt some of the practices in order to continue the traditions. And so in very different ways, they kind of negotiated counterforces and continued the vision. So what you are seeing is a portrait of the founder of Jaipur. Jaipur was founded in 1727. And Indian painting is usually known for, very small sized, very detailed paintings, which you kind of hold in your hands and look at, and it's not sort of gallery art. And what is really surprising is that in the 18th century, you find in Jaipur these very large life-size portraits. The artist is Sahib Ram, and you find very large portraits of the kings of Jaipur in the palace and in the museums. So this is one of the portraits, and you can see, the king has aged. He's graying. There is a halo around him, so he's kind of assumed some sort of divine position. He's obviously in the later years of his career, so he's holding a walking stick, and he's very fashionably dressed. He's got this very sheer, jama and a heavily pleated sort of a frock, and his red shoes match his turban and the jewelry as well. So very elegant, very sort of, a calm expression, as if sort of have, a sense of achievement towards the last years of his life. So this is in a way an amplified portrait of a king who in a way is breaking all kind of notions of how royalty is often portrayed. It's not a full frontal portrait, it's not heavily jeweled, it's not got the accoutrements of what royal luxury is, but is a very elegant, of a senior sort of a king. This is where he was born. He was born in Amer, which is just outside the walled city of Jaipur. And Amer, as you can see, is sort of a kind of a fort, and it's nestled between hills. So it's very protected. It's very very defensive in its architecture. And this is where his forefathers were as well. So this is where he dreamt of Jaipur in a way. And what he does is he decides to descend on the plains. And this was a very radical, dramatic decision. Bear in mind, the 18th century is when Aurangzeb's on the throne. Aurangzeb's not, somebody who's very keen on territorial expansion. Mughal power is already waning. So he chooses the opportunity very strategically to kind of announce his arrival, as it were, as the kind of the next Mughal or the next power on the scene. So he decides to build a brand new city. And building cities is the most powerful kind of declaration of one's authority, and also there are lots of examples in history where new cities are built to kind of reestablish power and claim authority from an already waning power in the past. So this is a photograph. Of course, it's a photograph. 19th century photograph, because the camera was invented in 1850. So of Jaipur still being built, and you can see the landscape. It's a flat site, gently sloping towards north, and it abuts road that the Mughals use to go on pilgrim to Agra and Ajmer. What he does is he does two things. What he does before the city is built, he establishes time in a sense that he recalibrates time. 18th century was a time when we've got this is a court of Hindu Orthodox king. There was always this power conflict between the two main power centers or political centers were one that held the physical might and the other one that held the intellectual might. So the Kshatriyas and the Brahmins. Brahmins were this, so-called scholarly priestly caste, and the Kshatriyas were the, the rulers and the kings and the ones who did all the territorial expansion. And the daily life of a king would be governed by what, the Brahmins will tell him to do. So the Brahmins held the time, as it were, in their hands, in the sense that it was through almanacs, it was through astrological predictions. So the Brahmins will chart out the daily routine of the king and tell him when to get up, where to go, when to sleep. So it was not, it was quite annoying for probably any king to be told what to do all the time. So, and also the problem also was that there were many schools of Brahminical thought that, that two Brahmins would not agree with each other, as to what the correct time is, because these were calculated astrologically. So what 18th century in 1727, what Jai Singh does is he builds sort of a huge, huge astrolabe. Astrolabe, these were small brass instruments from where you could kind of, calculate the constellations, the movement of the stars. And he builds these instruments in concrete. These are massive instruments from where you can read where the zodiac is and the constellations are, and how what the date is. And so instead of saying to the Brahmins, what is the zodiac sign at the moment, he would say to the Brahmins, come and show me on the site, on Jantar Mantar. This is called Jantar Mantar. Show me where that you're correct. And what he does is he initiates this evidence-based knowledge system where everybody will have to show him on the clock. And so you have to regard this as a clock tower, 18th century clock tower, through which everybody will read time, and nobody will say, oh, it's not 6 o'clock yet because my watch doesn't say it's 6. Everybody reads from the same clock. So this is a sort of a pre-modern clock tower, which kind of holds the time for the city. And that's why very often you see that, many cities will establish a clock tower in the center to kind of a church and a clock tower, or in Indian cities will be kind of marked with divine presence and time. So space and time are the two main markers of, a new city. What he also does to mark space is he brings with him a Govindev, who's this Krishna, who is found, he's found earlier around 16th century by Prabhupada, and he's then installed in Govindev temple in Vrindavan, and then Aurangzeb, who goes around breaking few temples. Jai Singh rescues Govindev and brings him to Connah Vrindavan, which is just outside Jaipur, and then brings him to this pavilion, which, as you can see, typologically, it's not a temple. This was a hunting lodge on the site, and you can see the water spouts that are on the sunshade, and in the shape of bulls with horns. And he establishes the center of space, as it were, as the divine center of the city by housing Govindev here, and then Radha joins him as well subsequently, and the two Sakhis, who are the two friends of Govindev, also join him. So this whole kind of group of people, of gods, come and become the center of the city. So there is a sacred center of the city, and there is a time that is marked by Jantar Mantar. And this temple, Govindev temple, continues to be of huge importance to the people of Jaipur, and you can tell by the the length of the queue that is there in front of it before every exam, you'll find hundreds of students visiting Govind Dev temple for his blessings. So, and also, I mean, this talk is also about material culture. So you can see how, material culture will also have its life, and it can form by repositioning itself. It kind of can form a center of a new establishment, or a city in this case. And this is a picture which I want to show you how, this is from the palace. This is from Chandra Mahal, which is the palace of in the city. And it is aligned directly, and this is the Govind Dev temple, and on the far end is Surya temple, which is temple dedicated to sun. And so it's completely aligned towards east. And east is marked not only by the temple, but also by the temple of the sun, the Surya temple on the hill. So, and of course, if you go around with the compass looking at, whether it's, correct east or not, of course it's not, but it is east because of the sun temple, and not because what your compass says. So there is a huge power on how these spaces are read because of these markers. King number 2 is Ram Singh, who reigned between 1835 and 1880, so 19th century, between his reign. So this is how he would have portrayed himself. And this is how, he would be seated, and with a lot of, he's wearing jewelry, fine clothes with arms and shield in front, and he was a Shaivite king, so you can see the horizontal tilak on his forehead, and heavily embroidered backdrop, bolsters. So it's a very rich setting. What Ram Singh does is he sort of changes the way royalty, kings could be portrayed by actually self-imaging himself. So it's almost, he takes control of how he would image himself as the king. And what he does is he's a very keen photographer. So he sets up a photography lab in the palace, and this is, at the same time as photography is just being invented in Europe. So he's setting up the lab in the city palace in the 1850s, and he produces photographs almost every day as a hobby. So this, he would have kind of curated. This is obviously not a selfie, but it's a self-curated photograph. He would have, that time he would have used glass negatives, and he would have, told his assistants where to place the camera. But also you can see the way he's seated on furniture, almost Victorian sort of chair, and his walking stick, and holding the walking stick almost as a cigar. And, so there is and how he's, gently crossing his legs and resting one arm on a table. So he's very, very at ease, and wearing spectacles. This is also something new, not only because, kings never wore spectacles, but also because, spectacles were invented in 19th century. So there's a lot of technological shift that's happening in the 19th century. There is glass, there is photography, there is furniture, there is, modernity. Shoes are different, and so all of that is, but it's really a kind of also a mix of, his turban and his clothes have very strongly a kind of a Rajput design element to it. And this is one of his very well-known photographs of him sitting cross-legged on the floor, and almost sort of performing a ritual or praying. And he's got ash marks on his body and his forehead. So it's a share white. And again, portraying himself as an ascetic was something that kind of shifts how kings are seen or want to be seen as. So he's pushing boundaries, both technologically, both in terms of image making, both in terms of, it's not just about, photography being portable and reproducible, but also it gives you an opportunity of using it. It's more intimate. So this is a very intimate sort of photograph where he's looking out of the window and he's sitting on the floor. And he took a lot of photographs of his courtesans, and in the Zanana there were, all the women who were, probably all faceless, nameless. He did many photographs of this very elegant courtesan, and you can see the jewelry and the way she's wrapped the sari, and again, cross-legged, like Krishna has his feet like that, and heavy anklets, and the same table, the same prop again features here, and the flower vase, and the backdrop is with swords of fabric and a fireplace, and the same chair on the right as well. And here you see a very confident woman, being photographed probably by the Maharaja himself. And he took several of these photographs. And of course, this is the shift that is happening, between painting as a medium of image making to photography as a medium of image making. So this is a painting that is based on a photograph, and it's, and you can see how it matches the early photograph that I showed you, and the same chair with the wheels that was in the photograph of the courtesan that we saw earlier, and the same table and the vase and the and the tablecloth. They didn't have many tablecloths, I think. So the same tablecloth features, and the vase and the chair on the right, and he's sitting on it. Again, very sort of reflective expression, not at all, threatening or sort of, authoritative. And also, anklets in one, feet, ankle. So, and also his clothes, heavily embroidered, and, the best craftsmanship was employed in, embroidering his waistcoat and jewelry, and the arms, and what he's holding. Very reluctantly, he's holding that sword. So he's that sort of a person. He's very, artistic. He's into photography. He's not at all interested in kind of, going on a horse and capturing few territories and then coming back and sleeping. He spends, and we know all this through his diaries because he kept a daily diary. And half the time he's spending in his photography lab, developing photographs. And he also had a lot of stomach upsets, it seems. So he was, always complaining about that. But he seemed to really enjoy taking photographs. The last king I want to talk to you about is Madhav Singh II. Who was the adopted son of Ram Singh, the photographer prince, as he's called. He was very unlike his father. He was, in Jaipur, all the kings are adopted. There is a story that, each of the kings were unable to produce a male heir, so they all adopt their heirs. And he was he belonged to a wrestler's family. He's a wrestler, and not, very artistic, or, so he always wrote in his, he wrote in his diary that, I'm not like my father, who's far more artistic and educated. And he saw himself as a gardener to the gardens that his father had sown, and he saw himself as somebody who tends his father's gardens. I think he was being too modest about himself. He was very sharp, very, very, his strategies to counter the British power, to kind of get a balance between, the the voices of the court and the pulls of the British Empire and the other Rajputs who were kind of politically, very, very obviously jealous of the Jaipur household, because it was quite a significant court in terms of the power it had. So Madhu Singh, worked very closely with taboos. And one of the things that, he had to do was to attend coronation of King Edward. And he had to travel abroad with the other Rajput kings. And he was invited. So all the Brahmins, would say that, how can you cross the seas? Because crossing the oceans was a taboo in the Hindu Orthodox court. And whoever crossed the seas would either be banished from court. So you were in danger of losing your job when you returned. So it was a serious, adventure. And so, of course, but politically he had to go there, because, he had to, it was also a statement of power. It was also, he had to show to the other Rajputs that, he could go there and come back, and that, so he had to, create a very fine balance between keeping the Brahmins happy and the, the British, who were the authority at that time, also pleased with his conduct. So, there were already voices of dissent saying, this Maharaja is, wining and dining with the British, who eat beef and drink wine, and they're so polluted. And how can you bring these polluted people into the court? So there was a lot of criticism around. So what he did cleverly was he built this very fine building, and he commissioned Swinton Jacob, who of course then trained Chiman Lal, who was a craftsman, how to, he trained him in drawing, and they built this Mubarak Mahal, which is a very beautiful symmetrical building just outside the boundary of the palace, to kind of, negotiate through, find his way out through this criticism. And he said, I'm not bringing them to the palace. They're outside the palace and outside of, the pure bit. So he could, get away. So this was designed and built for the entertainment of his British guests. And, and then he prepared for this invitation, and he had to go abroad and attend this ceremony. And he would, dress in this robe and, with the turbans, and you can see the kalgi, and he took with him all his fine clothes and jewelry. And how would he travel? Because, all the ships that were used to travel, were already polluted, because there was, wine being served and beef being eaten on the ship. How could it? It was already impure. So he commissions a brand new ship called SS Olympia, and he has it washed in milk to purify it. And then it had 3 separate floors, one for, Gopal. So Gopalji was, part of the Govindev temple. He's almost like a portable Krishna that you could carry with you wherever you go. So he carried Gopalji with him and put him on the topmost floor of the ship. And then the next floor was his, and the lowest floor was his assistants and attendants and the cooks. And he took with him spices and food and all sorts of things. So he could say, I'm only eating ghar ka khana, home cooked food. Nothing will pollute me. And what he also took, which was very important to do, was he took water with him from the sacred river Ganga. And this is here you can see him here performing the Samudrapujan, which is prayers to the ocean for his safety. And he conducts all the rituals very, very meticulously to, please all the Brahmins, and everybody you can see is watching him carefully, is he making any mistake? Is he doing this? And you can imagine his position, sitting surrounded by people who would criticize him at any kind of mistake he'll make. And so it was not easy to be a king. I mean, it's a lot of hard work. And so he's preparing for the journey. And what he also carries with him are these Ganga Jalis. Ganga Jalis are, usually very small silver vessels, which you take with you when you visit the river Ganga, which is a sacred river of our country. And you go and you carry some Ganga water and you bring it home. And it is believed that it has that power that it can purify the water that you use at home. So all you have to do is, sprinkle little drops from that Ganga Jali, and a little Ganga Jali will last you a year, and then you refill it when you go next. So every household will have a sort of a silver vessel of Ganga Jali. So Ganga water is the best water you can have. It has that divine belief to have that divine power. So he carries these water bottles with him filled with Ganga water to say to the Brahmins, look, I'm only having Ganga water. I'm not even drinking their water. But who's checking? So he commissions these large silver water bottles, and just to show you the scale, they are huge. There were 12 of them, which went with him with enough water to last his journey and back, so that he will not pollute himself and he'll come back unpolluted back to his throne. So it was important for him to kind of have that narrative, to have that story, to kind of respect people's sentiments and the counterforce. As I said, you have to kind of anticipate the criticism and take enough steps to sort of counter that. So this is my last slide, just to kind of wrap up, to say, there is this material of disruption, which I've shown you. It's this is the penultimate slide, where new markers of space and time can be established to kind of disrupt the older ones and take the whole kind of city, in this case, to a new dimension. And Jaipur, of course, was founded to be a commercial city. It's not an institutional city or a religious city. It was designed to make profit, to kind of sell goods, and to sell goods, to sell excellent craftsmanship. And the second king, of course, was a kind of shift through photography towards self-imaging. And the third one was to kind of shows very clearly how, he establishes ways, he shows ways of negotiating boundaries and building a strong storyline and narrative. And this is my last slide, which is a beautiful painting, 18th century painting, pre-photography, which shows you, and this is an episode where there is a story where a very poor friend of Krishna visits him in his palace, and this is a painting of an idyllic palace, sort of a paradise surrounded by ocean, water, and But the amount of material that you see here, the carpets and the chicks and the clothes, and animals are wearing jewelry, and people are wearing jewelry, and there are, you know, thousands of objects. These are all dynamic objects. They are dynamic, not just in terms of how they're produced. They're not even, you know, they are cultural productions, and dynamic also in terms of how they will have their own life, and they will go from one place to another, and by repositioning objects, you know, the whole culture and life around that object is repositioned. Not to miss the little boat on the bottom left. That's my last slide.
Thank you, Vibhuti. What a fascinating set of stories, I must say. And this negotiation between tradition and modernity, or Indian and colonial, is so evident. And I think that really sets up the stage for Roger to come in and talk about another set of stories that he brings in through his exploration in India. So I would invite Leanne now to introduce Roger, and then we will have his set of stories. Really looking forward to the conversation after as well. Leanne?
Yeah. So Roger William Connah lives in Ruthin, North Wales, UK. He is currently Associate Professor at Azrieli School of Architecture and Urbanism and Carleton University in Ottawa. He is a visiting professor at the School of Art and Design, Guangdong University of Technology, and was an international chair at the Sushant School of Art and Architecture. He is responsible for a series of publications, exhibitions, and films carried out over 4 decades in Finland, Sweden, India, Pakistan, Italy, USA, UK, and Canada. He has published over 20 books on architecture, art, material culture, cinema, and society, including Writing Architecture, Finland Modern Architecture in History, How Architecture Got Its Hump, Welcome to the Hotel Architecture, Nexus, Designing Disruption and Celebration, amongst others. Without further ado, let's welcome Roger.
Thank you. Just let me negotiate this technology on a Saturday afternoon. Saturday afternoons are not really meant for technology. Now, how are we doing? Are you seeing my screen? Are you seeing my screen now?
Yes, yes, Roger.
Good. Sorry, that's not supposed to happen. That's technology takes over. Disruption. Thank you, Vibhuti. I think there are parallels which will be quite interesting to look at. Tell me if anything goes wrong in terms of the projection, so that I'm not talking into the void, for example.
Yes, I will.
Okay, thanks. Disrupting disruption. You will notice the question mark. It is there for a reason. In a way, it signals a disruption of this very presentation. Disruption is both a knowing concept and one which relies on stealth. It intervenes and interferes with systems, but more so. As Vibhuti has shown, it is a knowing concept connected and can be seen as a way to use and develop mental tools that can activate positive and, as we're calling it today, mindful change. This includes problem solving through diversity. In more basic terms, it is to think differently. The word disruptive, of course, fits various discourses today around the notion of the mindful and the subsequent challenges on existing educational structure and content. Disruptive thinking is now a relational activity used in education and research as much as business. But what if the disruption is quite another? Like, for example, that acted out by students on a traffic roundabout in India. How might we celebrate this? At first, I thought I would introduce the project in Ahmedabad, India, with critical settings on materialism, material culture, and material thinking. It might be framed as an example of material thinking. According to Paul Carter, an Australian writer, researcher, in his work of the same name, material thinking is a record of creative research, a phrase that ought to be acknowledged, ought to be an acknowledgeable tautology. If research implies finding something that was not there before, Carter writes, it ought to be obvious that it involves the imagination. This project in India could also be framed as a creative research project, an example of design, environmental, and material culture in practice. For this, we would recall the pioneering work of Raymond Williams, a British cultural theorist, who outlined this in his work on materialism and culture. Williams writes in Problems in Materialism and Culture, 1980, quote, as a matter of general theory, it is useful to recognize that means of communication are themselves means of production. There is a third framing which comes to mind immediately when we think of the theme of this webinar, celebrating disruption. Here we cannot fail to link this to the current issues in education around unlearning and deschooling. Whether we speak of Ivan Illich with his pioneering works like Deschooling Society from 1970, or later Jacques Rancière in his volume The Ignorant Schoolmaster, 1991. In 1956, the government of India invited the design team of Charles and Ray Eames to recommend a program of design as an aid to small industries in India. Based on the Eames document, the India Report, the government set up the National Institute of Design in 1961. With a strong modernist spirit steered by the Sarabhai family, NID was set up to promote Indian culture through a pioneering education. The balance between tradition and the philosophy of machine aesthetics led to NID being the scene of a revolutionary experimentation in design. Faculty and students searched for the Indian identity across all aspects of life. NID became an autonomous national institution for research, service, and training in industrial design and visual communication. It has since expanded to 2 other campuses and was recognized as an institute of national importance by the Indian government in 2014. I will briefly set the scene in 1987. I was invited as a visiting professor to conduct a workshop and eventually carry out a project with design students at NID. I was at the time teaching film at the Mass Communications Research Center, MCRC, in Jamia Millia Islamia in South Delhi. Terms like restorative design, relational art, fuzzy thinking, disruptive teaching, or design ethics were not around at the time. Designers were still considered privileged producers of objects, some of which communicated better than others, some of which were produced and consumed greater than others. No one was yet decolonizing a heavily layered Western idiom and ideology. But there was a feeling of relief in the students and dread to the institute when it was announced our project would be situated outside the institute. Simply a group of 20 3rd, 4th, fifth-year industrial design and visual communication students were to occupy a traffic roundabout in a busy city in India and take it from there. I felt in the busyness of life at that moment, there was no program that could be written down, no theory that could be expectated, and no commitment defined in advance. From the outset, the studio was set up as a design practice, but there were no received images. At some stage, in the haste that was my life in India at that time, the project was given the name Nexus. Nexus meaning a connection or series of connections linking two or more things. It became obvious to me that there was both a nexus and a disruption between the institute and the city. The Paldi roundabout, less than half a kilometer away from NID campus, would be the site for a 2-month design studio. Paldi was a busy, endless public space which had boundaries only defined by the students. A recent report on traffic movements by the Ahmedabad Municipal Corporation of 9 of Ahmedabad's busiest junctions revealed that every minute between 142 to 420 vehicles pass them in peak hours. 142 to 420. Peak hours generally last throughout the day. The Vadaj junction was close to 417 and the least busiest at 129 vehicles per minute. We can imagine Paldi somewhere in between. Perhaps in the 1980s, of course, it was less, but replace the image of cars today in the image on the screen on the right. Replace those with images of auto rickshaws, hand carts, cycle rickshaws, bicycles, scooters, oxen-drawn carts, and cars. The picture would be quite similar to the one you have here. Students were to step outside the Institute for the first time since its inception in 1961. There was very little money for any work. We were faced with a very hot month in summer, sitting and occupying the roundabout. It was so hot that we shifted our collaborative classes to the afternoon, planned the ideas in the campus, and then organized a period of working, of sleeping on charpoys and speaking in various languages to the inhabitants of that space, meaning the villagers. Our working time was usually from 3 or 4 in the afternoon until after midnight. We had a decision to make. To produce anything with so little money, we had to decide on materials. It became obvious from the workshops around the roundabout that there were only 2 things we could afford: cloth and bamboo. The rest was endless collaboration, open thinking, design, and adventure. And yes, probably disruption. 4 weeks of study, initial discussions, visits to the roundabout, sleeping there, eating there, hanging out there. The students discussed, drew out, made models and prototypes. Was this design as a spatial or material practice? Was it macro to micro and back again? Material and structures were considered in ways unlike their usual classes or workshops. Some constructed maps, all analyzed the site in their own way. Ideas went from theatre, events, an opera, a rock show, but at all times students were to collaborate with and celebrate those occupying or dwelling on the site. You can see a little drawing on this to the top left. At the time, I was experimenting with all sorts of ways of doing graphics, but the drawing is simple. Think Paldi, eat Paldi, sleep Paldi, dream Paldi, run Paldi, stop Paldi, delight Paldi, celebrate Paldi, forget Paldi, remember Paldi. To ask students to collaborate with a public located on the traffic roundabout was, of course, a disruption. It was a disruption of their own embedded structure of being educated in design on a private campus, separated from any public they may be working for or thinking about. So we drew strange drawings, mapped out unknown activities, and began to imagine design and mythology returning to the site. Interactive groups were formed to explore interventions on the roundabout, using sound and light, information systems, posters, graphics, advertising, and existing billboards. Many had no knowledge about coordinating this in a real-life situation. I didn't have much more either. We were inventing and freewheeling. Structures of bamboo could minimally alter space, and by grafting onto a billboard, we did so. Events for the surrounding villages, the Poldi community, and children were also planned and curated. Here you see how the existing advertising board has been, the steel columns supporting it have been used to support a surrounding little construction which actually could fold away and disappear. So the students had to sew this and actually work out the, experiment with the bending of the bamboo to create this sort of folding canopy. Vendors got new shelters, which became new gathering points. Here you'll see the vendor and his child who comes in to sew, coming in every day, setting up a place on the roundabout to work. Usually the space or the protection from the sun wasn't very great. So one of the projects became this one to provide them with a structure to work in more shelter. It became so successful that of course others came to sit under it, and it suddenly became one of the many gathering places that started to happen on the roundabout. There was, we thought, to be a central gathering point. This was to be an area to exchange ideas and discussions with the local people and villagers. There was a tree overhanging, waiting to be used. It became a tent designed and hung, using that existing branch and using just bamboo and cloth. Designed to create shade and using cotton reels, wire and bamboo, it could slide back, collapse for the night. We called it the Silkworm. Anyone was welcome. We held studio discussions, seminars, poetry readings, and open discussions. Inside the Silkworm, the villagers came. The police hung out and the students began shaping a bond with both people and space. Inside it was our Hyde Park corner. Local juice wallers and others set up their own stalls outside. You can see in the top left corner a situation where I am speaking with my assistant, and we are discussing and having a little discussion with the students there, and the people in Paldi were coming to the entrance and looking on, and then it became well known. They just came and sat in and carried on the whole adventure. Other constructions, appendages, were designed, often on site, utilizing existing structures and spaces. Vendors would be encouraged to fold up their structure, take it home on their bicycle, and bring it and fix it the next day. So this was the existing, one of the structures made before, and this was one we tried to suggest to the shoewalla, who could fold it up in this way. You can see the single piece of bamboo could be fixed by wire to the railing, and the arch, like the umbrella type form, could spread out, cover, provide protection, and be folded away and taken on a bicycle back. The same with the one on the right. You see the little cotton, and those wooden cotton reels allowed the whole structure to slide back, lift up, and fold away. Trees, billboards, railings, traffic islands were all used to create new flexible shelters, new spaces out of the sun for any of the incoming craftsmen or anyone who was using the roundabout for their business. A flexible event space was imagined by one of the student groups. They wanted to create an environment for impromptu events, theatre, snake charmers, dancers. Here was where a chance community gathered as the students tried to coordinate the unusual. Again, my own condition to the students was that they had to negotiate and discuss this with everyone on the site. There was no other authority. They had to agree to a collaboration. So it was up to them to talk, and this was part of their social engagement on the site. The students took on the task of organizing and coordinating all such events with the villages. We had snake charm. Again, the students working with the villagers. They brought snake charmers. They staged a wrestling match. They staged a mime show, and on the right, with these sort of the blue cloth, very difficult to hang blue cloth like that. It looked in a way better on the drawing because the wind was so fierce that it always, but in a way the failure of it became part of its success because it actually did define the space and people gathered. Focal point facing the roundabout was the temple. It was painted in a somewhat drab light turquoise, and one student led a narrative project team using paint and what they called big graphics. I gave them again only one condition. The students had to negotiate everything about the project with the pandit. You'll see here the pandit on the right, and you'll see the on the left. The painting of the walls, the narrative of the stories, and the structure of the work was discussed. Often painting between the students was planned and carried out at night. There was established an immense trust between them. You can see on the right how one of the students was drawing and sketching out the narrative, the mythology, and some of them were filling in. They were helping each other. The temple project was so successful, the pandit offered to buy even more paint and even asked the students to help teach the locals and villagers to paint in narrative form. Students were encouraged to work differently, leading one group but helping another group to work with the locals. There were no boundaries in this project. They wanted to celebrate the space too. April the 18th was Hanuman Jayanti, and with other students coming in from the visual communication and participating, the local Hanuman Chaurasti temple was finished. The narratives were planned, discussed with the pandit and all temple goers. Drawings and sketches were shown to them before the big work started, and they all volunteered to paint. So the students were actually in control of a painting team that came from the village besides painting themselves. The big graphic became a meta wall on the outside and reflected what was going on the roundabout itself. Here you can see the three Babas who regularly sat on a bench outside the temple facing the roundabout. You'll see behind them they're drawn on the wall as well. So the wall became a reflexive version of what was happening all around the roundabout. So the three Babas became celebrities. Their story was also told. They became the brief celebrities, and another discussion area was created. We called this series of experiments Rump Ahead. This was our semiotic exercise. In our seminars and classes, I have been talking to students about semiotics, the theory of signs, and the current interest in the signifier and signified. Rump Ahead. These works were exquisite, exquisitely handled with the made with black bamboo frame and just with a small metal fixing with a piece of about 1.5 inch thick polystyrene cut very elegantly to make this silhouette. Seduction and resistance became a favored word as we explored the mechanics of advertising and the means of communication. A group played around with the word pot and integrated gold spot and tried to integrate some elements in the roundabout embed it within the existing structures. This was a way to insinuate sign into the space, which the students did at both a witty and a literal level. Then there was the zebra crossing. The notion of the road accident was always a constant theme on the roundabout. To cross the busy roundabout on foot was always taking a chance. So one student, two of them, wanted to create the notion of a mythical zebra crossing, which of course you would cross up and over, but you would never actually get to the other side of the road. There was a surrealism in these that kind of worked very well, and they started to also get people to move over into these areas and start discussing what was going on in here. I call this the Gujarati photo shoot. A group of 3 students wanted to celebrate the Paldi bus depot and the daily visitors. A canopy was imagined as a signal of this daily movement. The Gujarati men came to pose and chat with those who could speak Gujarati, and the students eventually also formed a little bond around that area. Finally, to celebrate the end of an immense 8-week period, and I've only shown you a fraction of this in a way of the images, but to celebrate this 8-week period, the students organized on April the 29th and 29th, a weekend of planned and unplanned celebrations. It was to be a shared festival by the students with the villagers. It included those wrestling bouts I talked about, theatre, mime, song, and film. Flyers and information systems were set up around the roundabout with short texts which acted as invitations. 3 students imagined designing and setting up a screen on top of the curved concrete roof of the bus depot. It was a challenge itself, of course, to erect with chance bamboo a frame big enough, a frame on which a projection could be made. After various trials and errors, a screen was created. I have no idea how they succeeded in this, so busy were the final 2 days, but the whole group decided on a finale to the project. The one image you do not see here is the final unforgettable event of the Nexus project on Paldi Roundabout. It occurred on a night at the end of April 1987 and began at midnight. At the time, I had been writing film criticism for the Times of India and had written on the film Mirch Masala by the director from Ahmedabad, Ketan Mehta. The students suggested we end with a film for the whole community. We thought of the film Holi by the same director, a well-known production of the Festival of Colour. To achieve this, I set the students the same conditions. The students were to conduct all negotiations with the authorities and the police to do this. Perhaps it was because I was also treated as the Burra Saab, we have to accept that the police spoke to us. Over cups of chai in the police station, "Of course you can show the film at midnight," the police sergeant said. "In fact, we'll close off all the roads, but on one condition," which was, we can all come along too. It was a deal. I have no idea how we achieved it, projected the film, or the screen stayed up long enough. But that closing night at midnight, Paldi Roundabout was full with a near 2,000 people sitting all around watching Holi. People had come in from all the surrounding villages nearby. It had spread by word of mouth. 2,000 was probably a conservative estimate. The police lined their cars, blocking the roads into the roundabout. They leant on their cars, walked around, chatted and watched. I watched it with Ketan Mehta as we walked between the people sitting all around the roundabout. It was quite simply the most unique, and for me, possibly my assistant Nita too, the best teaching moment of my life. So, disrupting disruption, question mark. Yes, we might say that the Nexus studio utilized disrupted and celebrated objects, events, and actors on the Paldi traffic roundabout. And we can also, as academics, epistemize these discussions. We can deliberate on material culture, mindful architecture, and design. We can rethink modes of material design practice and the other. But unless we find new ways of seeing this as material thinking beyond the academy and institute, I have to wonder what exactly is the disruption taking place. To sum up in fragile manner, without overthinking it, without over-teaching it, I had helped students discover things that I discovered with them. There were few prompts, short fragments of text and drawings, but there was no written page, no language of the teacher that necessitated me to explain further. I would agree with Jacques Rancière in his book, The Ignorant Schoolmaster. There is nothing beyond text except the will to express, that is, to translate. So we moved along in a manner of riddles, emancipatory moves, you might say, figuring it out for ourselves on a traffic roundabout. Considered by The Economist as the most influential business idea of recent years, what does it actually mean? And how can we use disruptive thinking as teachers and designers to drive real mindful change? Show us what makes you design what you design. There was ultimately in Nexus no other method. I must teach you that I have nothing to teach you. What then is disruptive thinking? And was Nexus an intervention, an interference, or a disruption? Or did it disrupt disruption? Nexus was not only a material practice, it was a social and unknown intellectual adventure for the students. Tonight it might be called a mashup. It was also an inescapable collaboration with those the students might have considered the other. In this context, the other were all the people who lived on, slept nearby, or worked on the Paldi Roundabout and bus depot. Nearly 2,000 of them walked to see the film Holi on that final evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. And that's a beautiful image that you end on. And can you tell us a little bit about that goat rubbing?
Yes, excuse me. Just throat is dry. Yes, I ended on it because it was the most extraordinary moment when, as I'd said, the external part of the temple had reflected what was happening around the roundabout. So we were talking about that idea of a sort of meta system, and the students understand this well. But actually, everyone who came to it understood it very well. They looked at this and then looked and saw the fake zebra crossing be opposite that. But it just struck me that you had that wall, and then suddenly a goat, black and white, was rubbing themselves against this wall. I don't know. It was just an extraordinary moment. It suddenly summed up to me the whole situation, where, because we dealt with oxen and cows and everything on the site, no one was forbidden. So I thought that was a beautiful image. And the image on the right just reminded me of the sorts of things that I was collecting from. I used to live in Lajpat Nagar in Delhi, and I would go to the market and always buy these little painted stories and collect them. And that was part of the imagination, I suppose, that was going around at the time, and the sorts of things, without me knowing much about it at all, but the sort of things the students would start talking about. And that, in fact, led to the whole, the temple painting exercise from these images.
That is beautiful. Thank you again for your presentation, Roger. Very enlightening. But also Vibhuti and Roger, when I start looking, there's a beautiful question, actually. I would like to bring that in because it ties into the thoughts that I was having about your presentation. It's a question from Tina Patel from Kent State University, and she says, thank you for the wonderful presentations and sharing the narratives. Can you comment on your presentation titles, Mindful Disruptors and Disrupting Disruption? Does that indicate a disruptive commonality? And I think it's a beautiful question in that sense, that I can see a lot of commonality, and probably you're trying to say the same thing through different lenses or through a play of words. And I would just like to open up that conversation and probably talk about how you feel about some of the commonalities or not between the two of your presentations.
Is that what she means, the commonality between the two of us, or the commonality between the notion of disruption? I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's the commonality of disruption in both of yours, but the ideas and how you've presented it, one indicating this mindful disruption and one disrupting the disruption. So I think that's a fine line. It's probably talking about the same thing. I don't know. I just want to hear about your thoughts on that.
Well, it's interesting about this. I mean, and Vibhuti knows NID well, and some of you may know NID. we were trying to capture this. It wasn't, yes, one might have said that one is disrupting the roundabout, but actually everything went on as it went on. There was nothing actually that broke the rhythm of the roundabout. So it wasn't the students invading. They were not invading. They were not stopping people doing their work. It was very much part of them being part of the roundabout, celebrating the roundabout as a social space. But they certainly were disrupting NID, because the National Institute of Design, as I said, had never been out of the campus to do some of their student works before. So therefore, it was quite unusual. What were they going to do outside? How could they represent themselves outside? The students were quite apprehensive at first, because it had not been tried. And as I said in the text, there were no images for it. There was nothing, there was no program. I couldn't write. How do you write a program for invading a traffic roundabout? You have to just go and sit and sleep and talk to the juice waller and talk to the pandit in the temple and just be on that roundabout. So that disrupted their design education back in NID, I would say. They were only conscious of doing that themselves later, when they went back to the campus and realized that, oh, we've done a project in a completely different way. We exist in this privileged Institute of Design, but we've actually done all the work in another space. That's so, because I left then, but I think, and Vibhuti could probably expand on this. I think it probably did, for a period, I don't know how long, but for a period, did test the existing teachers in the NID, not the students, but it did test them, because I suppose they must have, well, why haven't we ever done that? And I don't know whether that was something that, what do you think, Vibhuti, about that?
Yeah, I think the commonality is that both are internal disruptions that to the outside may not look as intense as it would be to people who are making it, and for the institutions that are that is the canvas for it. So so NID, in that case, the court in my case would be more shaken up than the outside world, because to the outside world there is a kind of a continuity. There is a kind of, it can't appear as disruptive in the sense, then it'll not be effective. So it is designed to shake up the system whilst being, but there is a commonality there, but also there is a difference in the sense that as I said, Jaipur City Palace, we're talking about pre-modern world of a society that has a shared knowledge system, so that every time there is a procession, for example, everybody knows that there is this, there is Holi. So nobody says, oh, what is this happening? Where is this fest? Why are people throwing color on each other? You know what I mean? There's a shared cultural knowledge system that, and so in my case, it's much more embedded in the society than in Roger's case, where there are spectators who would say, why is this blue cloth hanging on the, what is this happening? I mean, why are we got these folding? And that is the question that is worth kind of maybe also documenting, that, that voice doesn't seem to be documented enough. The three people sitting, what were they talking about?
Yeah.
How was it received by the police? Did they think it was quirky? Did they think it was kind of valuable? What was the discourse? And I'm sure there was, very, very important discourse that was happening around outside of the institution as well. So because I guess, there were people who were looking at this who were coming from a very different context. They were not NID students. They were, people who were probably not very privileged also.
Exactly. That's true. And at the time I mentioned Paul Carter and material thinking, and that he sees research also as part of a material and creative process. And you're right, Vibhuti, because those sorts of inquiries, which we could have done, or I would have recommended, if possible, to have the second 2 months of the workshop would have been a social study of that done back in the campus, and they could have gone and looked at it, but they didn't. That wasn't embedded in the design culture at the time. Although I think such research, I think, might be more embedded today. Would you say? I'm not just sure.
I'm not so sure. I think the gulf is only widened, not reduced.
Maybe.
I think the problem is that, there is this, majority of the people outside of these architecture and design institutions do not know what this is all about. And because of the fact that architects and designers continue to sit in their ivory towers and telling people, what is good design rather than collaborating with them. And this gulf is increased in India because of the institutions that are very much embedded in Western design thinking than in indigenous design models, which are yet to kind of be developed. And institutions like NID were at the forefront of this movement in the 80s, and Roger and I have often talked about this. The kind of spirit and the kind of intensity you see in Nexus, for example, to kind of do something, shake up something, reach out, somehow has just diminished, has gone out, and nobody gets cross, nobody gets angry about bad design anymore. I remember me as a student in the 80s also. I was an architecture student in SP, and every time this glass tower LIC building that Korea built in Connaught Place, we were very angry. We were thinking, why is he building this glass building in the heart of Delhi, in Connaught Place? It's got such an elegant arcade structure and this nonsensical heat box, and then now you've got it everywhere. So, and nobody gets disturbed or angry or think, this is disaster. Everybody's kind of, it's a process of numbing, you see, also has happened. And then, and it's everywhere. Now it's also become aspirational. So the tier 2 cities are also kind of following.
But it is true. Thinking of it then and thinking of it now, I remember the students some of them did contact me afterwards and said the biggest problem for NID is that the students had no decent portfolio of an object that they could make into their portfolio, because we were so busy. And this is something that we should have done, but we didn't do. We should have documented the whole process, because that's when it remains into a system. But we didn't. We were so busy collaborating and sleeping on the traffic island and actually working, in that heat, sewing and doing those. But we should have had just a 2-team, 2 of them making a film of it. So
but
we would, and we didn't.
But I think also you see there is merit in not documenting.
Maybe,
because,
yeah.
The dominant voice would have retained, and you would have not got the voice of the people who are around anyway. I mean, documentation also is a filter and a kind of protection strategy for the dominant voice. So, I mean, just to kind of counter what you are saying, but the methods of documentation are, especially architecture and design, are really.
Maybe you're right, and actually, maybe it was more disruptive because it didn't have, so they didn't have anything to document. So the students can prove, well, what did you actually do? Did you, oh, you put blue cloth across 2 telegraph wires and it failed. Is that your project? You know, and of course their project was actually talking to them, handling the villages and coordinating a theatre event. They did that too. It was all part of the process. Or setting up a mud wrestling ring in the middle of the traffic roundabout. So yes, I think you're right. I mean, that had a much more disruptive element back in NID, that there was no record of it apart from things that came in the newspaper, and that was it.
I think that is so fascinating because even today, with all the digital tools that we have, ultimately what everyone looks for is that seductive final image of a project that you've done, right? So I think Vibhuti and Roger, this idea of documentation really becomes questionable in such a process. I think that's a really neat observation. But I also wanted to point out quickly, Vibhuti, when you were talking about the kings, they were also disrupting in their own ways. But I think when I see the present tendencies where we are trying to modernize, if that's still a term, that we're trying to become global and follow these different technological advances that are there, we are trying to not lean it to the local conditions. But if the stories that you narrated, Vibhuti, was this negotiation between how it is perceived traditionally, how local people think about it, but also trying to make it a part of this ongoing system or the existing systems, which Roger's project also was trying to do. This idea, and I think that it wasn't a political colonial kind of an apparatus. It was this apparatus to bring in change and yet not disrupt everything that is already existing. I don't know. I feel that connection is all there. And at the risk of asking that, I will take the risk. But I would say, as Roger mentioned, he's a white person coming into India, doing these changes, which are allowed in certain ways because he comes from Britain, and there is somehow this colonial framework still lurking in the background. And he comes in, he makes those changes, but and that's why I like the negatives that he's brought into his title, saying disrupting disruption, almost like, in mathematics, the two negatives come together to make a positive. And I think Roger coming in, trying to somehow decolonize the education system, and being assisted in it, or also being, people being wary of his approach. That seems to me very fascinating, this idea of him coming in and NID trying to say, no, that's not a way to do, but he's in a way decolonizing education. He's trying to bring back the local, exactly what is happening on that Paldi roundabout. Do you know what your thoughts are about that, Roger and Vibhuti?
So I think shall I go first, Roger?
Yeah, yes, good. Yeah, please do.
So I think in this 18th century world, it was very important for the kings to be mindful of, what other people thought of them, because that was a survival strategy. Disruption was not a kind of, they had to do it because there was a great political pull because, the British had fixed the territories of the princely states, so they couldn't expand, and there were a lot of revenue to be given to them. And so they had to kind of negotiate with them politically, but yet also modernize, because there was new technology knocking at the door, and there was competition among the kings as well, who's superior, who's inferior, how many gun salutes you have, because those were the badges that were given by the colonial authority to them. So, Hyderabad was a big state, Jaipur was also big, and there were a lot of tiny states. So they were all kind of competing with each other in terms of where they are seated during the darbars, for example. So there was but they had to kind of also keep their portfolio, keep their CV ticking, as it were, for to be popular with the subjects, because there were instances where in Gujarat where they if the merchants were not happy, they would just walk out of the princely state and leave and settle elsewhere. So it was very important for Jai Singh to kind of give them a patient hearing, give them what they want, but also to establish the supremacy of Jaipur as the best place to shop in. So what I'm saying is, this was a survival strategy that you had to carry everybody with you, and the narrative had to be convincing for everyone. And when Madhav Singh went abroad, he wrote every week. He used to write. It's almost like sending an Instagram of where you are, what you're eating, what you're doing. Are you being pure? Are you being impure? So he had to give all these messages back home, saying I'm only drinking water from this. I'm only having my pickle, and I've got ghee with myself. And so these were important. These were important because it made people participate in what was happening, and also to feel valued. So this is different from the colonizer's strategy, where people are marginalized and power of authority and center are created, and then your voice does not matter, and only dominant voice, and everybody gets sidelined, and if you criticize, then you're kind of asked to shut up. And this kind of intolerance, I'm afraid, is coming back in many of our societies today. But I think also in Roger's case, I was just wondering how much of him being British and coming into an ID which was also established by Charles and Reims, and had this kind of foundations of reform, and was it easy or was it difficult? I mean, were there points where you could actually, because of your background, your nationality, you could achieve much more than, say, if you're professor in the same department said, okay, I'm going to take my students out and put a tent? Would there have been protests from his boss and you can't do that? What a silly idea. But because it is coming from you.
Yeah, it's a good point. It's a good point. I mean, I remember the director, Vinay Jha, at the time said at first the project would be an information system for the bus depot or the train station. And I don't know how it happened, but I certainly didn't want to spend 8 weeks doing an information system, designing the font and things. We could have done it, yes. But so I don't know whether it was between us or whether I'm not sure. But to respond, I think it's a valid point, and I want to, because I do think, of course, a lot of things happened because of that. But it comes back to a term. When I was about 17, I was working with a sergeant major in a bunker, in a storehouse. I don't know what I was doing. It was a student job. And he kept saying to me, he was a Scottish, and he'd obviously been to India. He always said to me in a Scottish accent, just come on, play the white man. And I couldn't understand what he meant. It's only later, much later, did I realize I was not playing the white man to him. I was not being either assertive or aggressive or speaking to the people supposedly under us in a offhand way. I was not asserting my white manness, but this was a phrase he had got from being in India. Come on, play the white man. So they would have said it in the army to their the officers under, you've got to learn to play the white man, which is a set of conditions that how you. So I would say that I never played the white man, not consciously, but I realize now. But I want to bring it full circle to what Vibhuti was saying, because in the 80s there wasn't. I don't know why, and she's right. It was a period of intense You can call it disruption, you can call it dissenting opinion, it was protest, but it was intelligent. The point is, it was intelligent. I'm not trying to say it isn't now. There's all sorts of things at work now that interfere with this intelligence, but it was creative and it was intelligent. And there were forms tried out in India with, where I was part of it and others outside it, which I think were part of breaking a lot of new ground. I don't know why it sort of went down again. Maybe this is cyclical. Vibhuti would know much more about that in terms of an Indian thing. But it is very true that you can get, it's in what Vibhuti was saying, this, whether I got away with doing things is because it was embedded in the society, not just because of me, but it was embedded in there. It was only when I had to go and apply for a visa where I had to learn how to fight in an Indian way, because you obey and wait to be called. You're never called in the visa office. You have to learn and how to intervene in the office and put your hand over someone else's hand and say, no, do mine now. And if you don't do that, someone else will, and you never get your visa. You just, and Vibhuti, you know it, don't you, Pallavi, too? So you learn these things, but whether there was a conscious, I don't know, decolonizing the colonizer, in other words, not behaving according to the kind of accepted Ferengi kind of position, I was pretty conscious that I didn't want to be a Ferengi. Of course, I was a Ferengi, but I didn't want to be. So I would work it in another way. But clearly, to come back to the point, the police closed all the roads, probably because I walked in with the students and they would speak to me. I don't think they would have closed the roads for the students, frankly. I would like to think they would, but I'm not sure they would have done, because I was there. They speak to me. Oh, this is going to be great. So yes, I'm sure there was an element of that going on.
Yeah.
But one funny story, can I?
Yeah.
So I went back from this in Ahmedabad, 1987, and I was immediately asked to do an exhibition with Gautam Bhatia in Delhi, Ravindra Bhavan Pavilion Gallery, called Shelter. And we did the story of Shelter from somebody living in the sewer pipes to ending up in Greater Kailash in a middle-class family. And we did installations. In that gallery, we installed a 40-meter length movie poster called Shelter. We gave the guys who painted the movies under the flyover in Greater Kailash certain photographs and said, you make the story. So they did. But at first they were apprehensive, and they started making their poster in ways that looked strangely Western. And we said to them, or Gautam did in using the language, but said to them, what are you doing? And they said, oh, Saab, we're in an art gallery now, so we have to paint like it's the West. You know, we can't paint what we paint under the motorway in Greater Kailash. That's for cinema. And so we said, no, we want the cinema poster in the gallery. And suddenly they were encouraged and got the trust of us that they could do their skill in the gallery. When we opened that exhibition, the chief minister came round with some MP and completely hated the whole thing. Totally hated the fact that we brought a Hindi movie poster into an art gallery called Shelter. So the movie is and talking about that sort of disruption, it was so disruptive. It came in the parliament the next day because it was paid for by HUDCO, which is the housing authority. And the member of parliament who'd been to the opening of the gallery said, is it right that we pay foreigners and designers to come in and do this sort of thing in our gallery? And that was brought into parliament. So you can only take that as success, I guess. That's disruption in a way.
I think that's a very poignant kind of a statement for me, because I feel that, you know, we are constantly here, at least in the West, we are talking about how we decolonize education. How do we? But there is somehow, I feel there is that flip that has to happen where the people in the system have to also start to decolonize their own thinking. And it's not something that is imposed on them. It's something that has been, like, it starts to become cultivated from within, and that has to be. And I think, Roger, your project was amazing in that way, to make people aware. I mean, I don't know if it happened then, but at least now that we're talking about it, I think it makes us aware of that intrinsic problem that might be existing that needs to be overcome. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, I as Vibhuti said, and she knows more about it in the education there, I'd like to think more of it could take place from the inside out.
Yeah.
But I'm not, I don't want to be so pessimistic, but I'm not, it's very hard for the reasons Vibhuti explained today, that doing it from the inside out is it's very difficult. You always seem to be able to do it from the outside in.
Mm-hmm.
Because you can risk yourselves when you put yourself outside and you enter, because you know you're not going to stay inside. But if you're inside, university, institute, whatever, if you're inside and you instigate it, you always, those who are inside risk thinking, oh, I might lose my privilege inside because I have done this. So I think it's, you see what I mean? It's delicate.
It's delicate. And I think, Vibhuti, I don't know if you agree with me when I say that the kings were doing it the inside out way, rather than outside in.
That's right. And I think, it was also, trying to kind of incorporate technology, new fashion, new ways of thinking, without breaking any hearts.
Yeah.
And then also, I think threads of communication have to be kept alive, and this idea that, the more people you carry, the number of people you're able to carry is the marker of success of that disruption. Mm-hmm. Rather than saying, okay, I did my thing and only, nobody came to watch it. It's not a success. So, so what I'm saying is, being elitist about it, which is now often done, that, many designers, or some designers would say, oh, these people don't understand design, what to do. That is, I think, such a kind of indicator of failure, because, I mean, who doesn't understand design? Good design, everybody understands good design. And to kind of do and ascend them with, and it's also, I think this gulf has been created because of language. There are people who think in different languages, and how do you kind of communicate effectively, if not in English? How do you communicate with them? And so, and I think, Pallavi, you said an important thing, that, the people who are inside the system, in the culture, also have to kind of try to make an effort to shake it, rather than just expect it from it to come outside. But, for 200-300 years, we've received it from outside, you see. So it's become such a habit that, we see the policeman as the Angrez who's behind us, trying to punish us, and rather than see the police as, as people who are us, you see. So, and the police force uses that image, or that kind of history that we
Yes,
have
it's a
gone.
trope. It's a trope they use, isn't it? I mean, and they very well. I think your point is good, because I think Vibhuti represents the inside out, which I think we're good to have as many people as Vibhuti who can be inside and actually do those sorts of whatever we call them, mindful changes, mindful disruptions from within. At the same time, I am someone who's come from outside. I've always been outside, even when I've been inside the faculty. So, but we need both, I think.
Mm-hmm.
We need both to work.
Absolutely. And I think I'll just read another question here, because we are talking about education. And this is a question from Kurt. And he says, a wonderful presentation and discussion. Can disruption be a viable design strategy? What are the approaches and processes designers / students can use in disruptive contexts? I think it's a very intense question.
Well, they can, but I think we're in danger of then trying to apply disruption, and applied disruption can become a technique. That may happen, but say you're coming back to what we said earlier, thinking differently. Disruptive thinking only came around, as Vibhuti noted, in the 1990s, and then business. But if you look back over the 20th century, and probably before what Vibhuti is saying, even things like lateral thinking was the same issue. Lateral thinking was disruptive. It's only disrupted to a different system that's set up. So it's disrupting the framework. So in answer to Kurt, yes, you can be disruptive. I mean, it depends how you want to fulfill. If it's design, how do you fulfill your brief? Do you have a brief? And if it's a brief, if it's product design or if it's environmental design, how do you fulfill that brief? But your job presumably would be to think differently. And if that's disruptive, then carry it through intelligently, creatively, but not disruption for disruption's sake.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think if the design, yeah, absolutely. I think Roger is absolutely right, because if the intentions of design are, focused well, and they are about equity, they are about well-being of people, then disruptive techniques ought to be used in design to achieve that. So as long as the focus is well-intentioned, and Gandhi was great as well in disrupting people's ideas about what clothing is, how to produce salt. He disrupted that, but he always used those core values of society, of humanistic values, of values where everybody had a voice, had a role to play, and was democratic and non-violent in the strategy. So we've got so many examples where as long as the intentions are well-meaning and for to provide equity and to dethrone these power positions who kind of use or misuse other people's resources, design has a great ability to do that.
We are reaching, it's quite interesting at the moment, because disruptive as a word also gets sort of bad press or colored, because take the recent protest in Bristol in England. You may and may not know, but okay, you start a protest about gender treatment because of the murder of a woman in London, in Clapham Common, and the police raided their protest and arrested women. So you have another protest in Bristol that's protesting at that protest. Then you have someone who wants to disrupt that protest for what we call, let's say, more anarchic, the anarchy side. Then you're suddenly, disruption is it's back to what Vibhuti said, a peaceful disruption. When it becomes a violent disruption, is it a disruption? Are we moving towards an anarchy in some of those. So people taking over a protest in Bristol maybe have another agenda that moves the protest and the disruption of the women who are peacefully marching for, you know, to commemorate that murdered woman. And then this protest is taken over by others who move in, and so it's a misuse of disruption. But I think that happens in so many different social processes, and it comes back, I think, to what we were saying, or Vibhuti was saying. How do we train the creative, intentional intelligence of our acts? And I mean our acts, you know, individually, not theirs outside, our acts. If
That is something that really comes out also through, I mean, we started with this discussion as a discussion on material culture, and definitely so many stories that these objects of material cultures of disruption that you brought forth, both of you, in terms of Vibhuti, the Ganga Jali, or in case of Roger, the very sleek, almost invisible kind of intervention that you did on the streets, or the very prominent ones on the temple walls. I think those are ways, or these become material culture, objects of material cultures of disruption. And I think that can lead to so many conversations, as we started, this idea of education, this idea of decolonization. And I think that it's been a wonderful conversation. I have my team here who have some questions for you as well. And being heedful of the time, I would say you're free to be brief about it, but I will hand it over now to the team. I think, Ashlyn, you're going to start with that?
I think Laura's going to start, actually.
So this first question is for Roger. What is a culture that fascinated you, and how have you integrated it into your personal culture?
What is? I mean, I know it's a bit obvious, but working in India just changed my life. I mean, I know it sounds extreme to say that. Maybe some of you haven't had your lives changed totally yet, but it did. So, and I can, you know, we don't have time, but I can analyze why the shock of certain things, the displacement, it disrupted me too. And I had to deal with it, not as a white man. I didn't play the white man. So that would be my answer. Because it made me realize that life was a practice I had to live every day. It was a practice. It was something I had to work at every day. Whereas I didn't need to do that when I was living in Finland. We can go into reasons why, but that changed. Did that answer, Laura?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Monica, I think you're next.
Okay. So first of all, I want to thank you, both of you, for your such wonderful presentation. And my question is for Vibhuti. So how do you think different countries view religious figures in design and their benefits in design?
Sorry, how does religion feature in design? Different cultures?
Yeah, so how do you think different countries view religious figures in design and their benefits in design?
Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, I think it's very, you know, religion is a very artificial, is a very artificial word, in the sense that, you know, there's no separation of religion from culture, for example. You know, so it's very kind of intertwined with you know, with material culture, in the sense that, you know, that's really a very good question, and I think a topic for another lecture on, you know, how you know, your interaction with an object even if you view it outside of your culture, is colored by your context. So, if you see Krishna in a museum, for example, and I showed you a picture of Govind Dev, who's like covered in clothes and jewelry and tilak, and I've never seen him without clothes, and he's but if you see him in a museum, he'll be without all those things, but he will still be Krishna in my head. So I can't decontextualize the encounter as modernism demands us to. When you go to a museum, and you visit the Indian Gallery, and you'll see all these statues, religious statues, idols. For a person who's, I'm a Hindu in the sense, I'm not a temple going Hindu, and being Hindu is not, there is no standard Hindu. All Hindus are different. All their practices are different. We have 33 million gods. We have, a diverse culture. There is no one particular Hinduism. There's no one particular text. For example, in other religions, you have the Quran, you have the Bible. So there is very strong presence of a text. There is no one text. So it's a very interesting, dynamic, religious presence that the culture has. And so what I was going to say is that it is very difficult to remove my or viewers, emotional engagement with the object when you see it in a museum. And modern scholarship demands this scholarly detachment. And I'm beginning to wonder, why should we be detached? Why can't we be attached? And why can't we be emotional about Krishna when we see him in a museum, although, in a starved, not bejeweled and clothed, and nobody's feeding him. But I have those stories in my head when I view these objects in the museum, and I think this kind of viewing is less artificial than what modernism demands of us. Modernism demands that you should be embarrassed about your culture, you should be embarrassed about your religion, you should not be thinking about gods. But India is a soul country. You can't take it out of its culture. We are a country that believes that there is a soul and there is an afterlife. Something, very interesting. The other day I was talking to somebody, and I said, I wish I had learned of this Buddhist text 40 years ago. And he said to me, well, there is another life. You will have another life, so it's never too late. So so I was taken by surprise. But this person wasn't. This person was, saying, of course we have, 7 lives, and there is karma, and there is, it's all very kind of, matter of factly. There's nothing wrong with it, So how do you, and the thing is that believing in soul does enrich your life, does make you more mindful of your actions, does make you more mindful of your environment. So why shouldn't it be good? So I think just to call it religion is actually, really viewing it very narrowly. You have to see the whole philosophy, you have to see the whole culture, you have to see the material culture, you have to see the manifestations of this philosophy in our surroundings to really understand. And anything that enriches your understanding of an object has to be good. Why is it bad? Did I answer your question? I think I went into by-lanes, but I hope I was on the main road.
You can start You can start the next session now
much.
if you like.
Beautiful how you answered that, Vibhuti. I think it's so beautiful. So matter-of-factly. I think it's beautiful.
We'll just segue into the soul now, okay? We'll do a whole session on the soul. What Vibhuti is identifying is it's quite interesting because I think, having been through what's now considered a modernist education, I think actually throughout everything that would have been useful for me. religious studies was turned into a mockery at grammar school. It shouldn't have been, but it was turned into a mockery, and it became put alongside, music or PE, physical education. I mean, how is that possible? A modernist education reduced this area of the world's knowledge to religious education 30 minutes every week, and that's enough in a modernist education. At the same time, they destroyed history because modernism sort of packaged history for their own narrative. So I think I'm only waking up. I mean, I'm only waking up now, I think, from the damage of a modernist education. And it's still being perpetuated. It's still going on very much. The tropes are embedded in our education, and that's why the talk of decolonizing education or deschooling after post-pandemic and things, that's why they're important, because it is deeply embedded in our curricula and in our syllabi.
Absolutely. Yeah, I have a lot of notes here going on.
So what's your next? This is the last in the series, isn't it?
Last in the series, yes.
So what's your next series? I think you should do a series on soul.
Okay, I will collaborate with Vibhuti on that. I find that
I think you should. I think you should, because we don't talk about it enough. And then if we do, we have to go to neuroscientists to think, because they're studying the brain, they have more knowledge about the soul. Come on, what is this? So do it. Vibhuti and Pallavi, do it. Soul.
Yeah.
I think Ashlyn has
do all the anti-modern words, emotion, soul,
absolutely. Yeah,
all the taboo words.
That's great, and it's a great thing that this is the last of the series, and we are talking about the next series already. Very, very exciting for me. Ashlyn,
you can call it soul, the soul and the anti-moderns. That's a French book called Les Anti-Modernes. Mm-hmm. That would be a very good debate and series to set up.
I made a note, and I'll get to work
I'll send you the reference.
Thank you.
I think we have two more questions for you guys. The first one's again for Roger here. Do you believe that the imagination and material expression go hand in hand, or are they influenced by existing cultural identities and surroundings?
Ooh, that's another, it's another hour, I think. No, imagination, yes, it can't survive without it. I mean, yes, it's embedded. If I understand you correctly, I wouldn't separate it. I would say that the life is the material is living in that imagination, which is what I sort of said at the beginning of the piece by that small piece from Paul Carter. I think that's. Is that okay, Ashlyn?
Yeah. Thank you. And then we've got another question for Vibhuti here. How has material culture changed or evolved to meet modern ideals? And what learning lessons can we take from past definitions of material culture?
In 2 minutes, please. Without going into soul. I think you have to understand that in the Indian history there has been this chasm, which defines the colonial rule and then independence and all the kind of local traditions, craft traditions were marginalized. So to the extent that you could be a fantastic builder of temples and vernacular architecture, but you cannot teach in an architecture school because you don't have a BArch degree and you don't have a license. So this kind of marginalization and support that the modern institutions, both political and society, from the society that the modern institutions received, meant that there was a lot of people who were marginalized. And bear in mind that, you know, production of legitimate knowledge is also production of ignorance. So that, you know, all these marginalized people were labeled as ignorant rather than, you know, having different kinds of skills for which we have to make space in the institution. They were kind of, you know, without education, without being able to speak English, without having a license. So you know, that was a huge setback for the indigenous craft skills and indigenous knowledge systems. And so much has been lost because of that. And I think a very kind of quickly, we'll have to make a lot of effort quickly to kind of regain and reestablish their positions. And it is happening now. I think there is a lot of good work going on in terms of, you know, looking at our environment, you know, indigenous plants, how to save them, how to populate our landscape with indigenous plants rather than flat lawns, which is such a kind of marker of colonial aesthetic. You know, so our whole landscape, not just physical and but also intellectual, has been kind of mowed down into flat land. You know, we have to kind of rebuild it, and I think it is beginning to happen. And I think this way, you know, material culture is something that is produced alongside, and you know, and I think Roger defined material culture very well. You know, so in the beginning, you know, taking from Paul Carter's material thinking. It will be an interesting exercise, which I might do, to kind of look at words that describe what you mean by material culture. What is, in different languages, what does that, what are objects? You know, what are the, you know, Hindi words for objects, or what are, and so new worlds might open up to explain. Sometimes, you know, vocabulary can give us new meanings to what we are struggling to find answers for. Sometimes we, you know, because it opens a whole new conceptual world. For example, you know, you say egg and anda are completely different. Anda means also center of the universe. It's also an egg, but you know, that gives a whole new concept to what you know, a thing could mean. So, and I think we need to populate our world through those concepts which are embedded in culture, through vocabulary, through meaning that can be reached through words, I think. And we have to also be very mindful of the kind of words we use to describe our culture, ourselves, our society, and it's full of biases and assumptions and highly gendered, and you know, little things like are completely even very funny to be used. You know, like a negative plug and a positive plug. I mean, what is this negative? And a female plug. You know, plug is defined as a male plug and a female plug. I mean, these are everyday objects which we use, and we kind of define them in terms of gender because of, I mean, it's just bizarre. Right? We need to kind of really think about all of that.
I think I have enough material for the next 3 series at least. Thank you both for that. Roger.
Can I just finish in answer to, or echoing Vibhuti, and it's a good way to end, because I was reading from a book this morning on the uses of literacy, and here's a statement by Alexis de Tocqueville, written in his book Democracy in America in the 1930s, when he traveled in America. And it's very opposite to what we're talking, or what we have talked. By this means, a kind of virtuous materialism may ultimately be established in the world, which would not corrupt, but innovate the soul, and noiselessly unbend its springs of action.
Beautiful.
That's
Lovely.
What
beautiful.
more can we say?
Thank you, Roger and Vibhuti. This has been such an inspirational session. Your presentations and the conversation that followed, it's been amazing, and I can't thank you enough for that.
Pleasure, a pleasure.
And thank you also to the audience. And
Thank you very much also for those who have been organizing this. Thank you.
thank you. So we'll sign off at this, but this is not the end of the conversation, but beginning of many more conversations, I feel. And I'll be in touch with both of you. And I think the students also will try and be in touch and keep reading your works. So thank you again.
Okay, thank you very much. Take care.
With
Take care,
pleasure.
everyone.
Thank you.
Bye for
Thank
now.
you so